Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your most comfortable blanket, and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to take a very long, very slow walk through the scorching sands of ancient Egypt. But we aren't looking at the Great Pyramids or the grand battles today. Instead, we're going behind the heavy stone walls of the royal harem, a place that was less about glamour and much more about bureaucratic nightmares, weird rituals, and people who had way too much time on their hands. It's a story of how the most powerful men on earth were essentially brought to their knees by palace gossip and some very poorly planned poisonings. So, get comfortable. Let's just drift back about 3,000 years. When we think of an Egyptian harem, we usually have this Hollywood image of silk curtains and people being fanned with palm fronds. But in reality, the Ipres, the secluded house, was more like a massive, self-sustaining corporate headquarters for the pharaoh's extended family. It was a sprawling complex of villas, weave shops, and administrative offices. It was also where the pharaoh kept his secondary wives, a polite term for a collection of international diplomatic trophies and local favorites who all spent their days trying to make sure their specific son was the one who ended up wearing the double crown. And that, of course, is where the trouble always started. Because when you have 100 people living in a palace with nothing to do but count linen and plot against the person in the next room, things are going to get weird. Let's float over to the reign of Ramesses III. Now, Ramesses III was a man who took his job very seriously. He fought off the sea peoples, he built massive temples, and he generally tried to act like a very big deal. But while he was busy being a living god and a military genius, his household was essentially a slow-motion car crash. You see, Ramesses had a lot of wives. His great royal wife was the important one, but he also had a secondary wife named T, and T was tired. She was tired of being the runner-up, and she was especially tired of her son, Prince Pentawere, being second in line for the throne. Now, in ancient Egypt, if you wanted to change the line of succession, you didn't just file a complaint with the vizier. You had to go a bit more supernatural. T and her group of harem conspirators decided that the best way to get rid of a pharaoh wasn't just a simple dagger in the dark. No, that would be too easy. They decided to use the forbidden arts. This sounds very dramatic, but in the context of the harem conspiracy, it mostly involves some very nervous palace officials, a few stolen magical scrolls, and some wax figurines that were supposed to make the royal guards go blind or fall asleep. It's the Bronze Age equivalent of trying to hack a security system using a voodoo doll and a lot of wishful thinking. The rituals involved in this harem trial were bizarre. The conspirators supposedly gathered in the dead of night within the women's quarters, a place where no man other than the pharaoh and the eunuchs was supposed to be. They had a list of accomplices that included the royal butler, because you always need the guy who brings the wine, the pantry overseer, and even the royal magician. Imagine a group of high-ranking officials huddled in a room full of expensive perfumes and looms, whispering about how they were going to turn the king into a wax doll. The plan was eventually carried out, and for a long time, historians thought it failed. But modern CT scans of Ramesses III's mummy show that someone actually did get to him. He had his throat slit so deeply that it went all the way to the bone. They even found an amulet of the Eye of Horus tucked into the wound by the embalmers, probably as a sort of, oops, let's fix this in the afterlife gesture. But here's the snarky part. Even though they successfully killed the pharaoh, the conspiracy still failed. The transition of power didn't go to T's son. Instead, the rightful heir, Ramesses IV, stepped in immediately, arrested everyone, and set up a special commission to put the entire harem on trial. This trial is where we get the judicial papyrus of Turin, which is basically a long, dry, and slightly sarcastic record of how much of a disaster this whole thing was. The judges weren't just politicians, they were handpicked by the new pharaoh to be impartial, which in ancient Egypt meant do whatever the new boss wants. But the trial itself turned into its own scandal. During the proceedings, some of the judges decided that the best way to spend their evening was to go to the harem and party with the very women they were supposed to be investigating, because why not double down on the corruption? When the pharaoh found out his judges were having celebratory drinks with the defendants, he didn't just fire them, he had their ears and noses cut off. It's a very pointed way of saying, I see what you did there. It also added to the general atmosphere of the trial, which had transitioned from a serious investigation into a royal assassination into a bizarre, bloody reality show where everyone was losing their appendages. As we look at the fate of Prince Pentawere, the son for whom this whole mess was started, things get even darker, but in that flat, historical way we like. He was allowed to take his own life. In the official records, they don't even use his real name because he was considered pure evil. They just call him the one who was called Pentawere. There is a mummy known as the Screaming Man found in a cache near the Valley of the Kings, buried in an unclean goatskin with his hands and feet bound, who many think is him. He looks like he regretted the whole wax figurine plan. But the harem trials weren't just a one-off event. They were a symptom of a much larger problem in the Egyptian court. The pharaoh was supposed to be a god, but he lived in a house full of people who knew exactly how human he was. They saw him when he was sick, they saw him when he was grumpy, and they certainly saw him when he was making questionable romantic choices. Let's float a little further back in time, to the Old Kingdom, to see that this wasn't just a new kingdom trend. Even in the days of the Great Pyramids, the harem was a place of administrative tension. There was a high-ranking official named Weni the Elder, who served under King Pepi I. Weni's autobiography is carved into his tomb, and he mentions in a very "shh, don't tell anyone" tone that he was once asked to conduct a secret investigation into the great royal wife herself. Imagine the stress of that job. You're a middle management bureaucrat, and the pharaoh whispers to you, hey, can you go into the harem and find out if my wife is trying to kill me? But do it quietly. I don't want the neighbors to know. Weni says he heard the case alone with the royal sealer, and he never tells us what the actual crime was or the verdict was. He just says he did a great job and moved on. It's the ultimate historical cliffhanger written in stone by a man who knew that keeping royal secrets was the only way to keep his head. The rituals of the harem weren't all about murder, though. Most of them were just incredibly tedious. There were rituals for how the linen was delivered, rituals for how the beer was brewed, and rituals for how the children were educated. The House of the Secluded was also a school. It was where the future elite of Egypt were raised. But being a child of the nursery meant that you were constantly surrounded by people who were looking for an edge. You weren't just learning to read hieroglyphs, you were learning exactly which butler could be bribed with a jar of honey and which lady-in-waiting was secretly related to the governor of a distant province. It was a world of soft power. In a society where the pharaoh had ultimate authority, the only way to influence him was to be in the room when he was relaxing, and since the harem was the only place he could truly relax, it became the most politically charged square mileage in the entire Nile Valley. It was a pressure cooker of ambition, wrapped in fine linen and smelling of incense. And as the dynasties rolled on, the pressure only increased, because the more secondary wives a pharaoh took, especially the foreign princesses sent from the Hittites or the Babylonians, the more the harem became a miniature version of the ancient world's geopolitics. If the pharaoh ignored the Hittite princess for a week, it wasn't just a domestic squabble, it was an international incident. Imagine the poor official in charge of harem logistics. You have to make sure the Babylonian princess has her specific type of oil, the Mitanni princess has her favorite handmaidens, and the Egyptian wives don't start a riot because the foreign girls got better jewelry. It was a logistical nightmare that frequently ended in someone reaching for the poison or the wax dolls. So, we've established that the Egyptian royal harem was less of a relaxing spa and more of a high-stakes nest of voodoo and HR violations. But let's look closer at the actual tools of the trade, the forbidden rituals that the conspirators thought would give them an edge over a living god. When the trial of the conspirators under Ramesses IV got underway, the court transcripts spent a surprising amount of time on arts and crafts. You see, in the Egyptian mind, there was no real line between politics and magic. It was all part of the same toolkit. If you wanted to overthrow a pharaoh, you didn't just need a sharp knife, you needed Heka. And the conspirators in the harem went all in on it. They didn't just steal gold or weapons, they stole secret books from the royal library, specifically books on how to make wax figurines. Imagine a group of high-ranking women and nervous palace officials huddled around a small fire, frantically sculpting little wax men that were supposed to look like the royal guards. They believed that if they chanted the right words, these little dolls would sap the strength of the real soldiers, making them unable to lift their spears when the assassins moved in. It's a bit ironic, really. These were the most elite people in the world, and their grand plan for a coup d'etat looked like a very intense, very illegal kindergarten class. One of the conspirators, a man named Messid Sur, which translates to Ra hates him, a name he was likely given by the court after his arrest because why not be petty, was accused of handing out these magical figurines and spells to the various participants. The script tells us they even tried to make magical powders to induce a deep sleep in the pharaoh's personal protectors. It's that classic bureaucratic overcomplication. Instead of just bribing the guards, they tried to enchant them. Because in the royal court, why do something simply when you can do it with a ritual that requires 48 hours of chanting and 3 different types of incense? But the rituals of the trial itself were just as strange as the magic that started them. When the conspiracy was uncovered, the state didn't just want to punish the bodies of the traitors, they wanted to delete their souls. This is the part that gets a bit dark, but in that flat administrative way that makes it even weirder. In Egypt, your name was your ticket to the afterlife. If your name was erased, you essentially stopped existing for eternity. So, the ritual of the trial involved a process of name damnation. The court records purposefully changed the names of the accused to something humiliating. Binem-Wise, whose name originally meant the one who was great in Thebes, was renamed the one who was evil in Thebes. Another was called Pa Bak Kamen, or the blind slave. It's the ultimate historical burn. They were writing these people into the records as losers for all of time, ensuring that even in the underworld, everyone would know they were the ones who messed up the palace coup. Let's float over to the actual sentencing. For the high-ranking members, the ones who weren't given the grace of taking their own lives, the punishments were designed to be spiritually unclean. In Egyptian culture, certain animals were considered chaotic. The pig, for instance. There are hints in various texts that criminals of this magnitude were sometimes associated with these unclean symbols to further degrade their status. And then there's the case of the screaming mummy again. If that truly is Prince Pentaware, the ritual of his burial was a masterpiece of spite. He wasn't mummified with the usual care. They didn't remove his organs. They just let him dry out, wrapped him in chemically treated goat skin, which was considered ritually impure, and shoved him into a corner of a tomb. It's the unritual, a purposeful, methodical way of saying, we hope you have a terrible time in the next life. But while the men were being mutilated or executed, the women of the harem faced a different kind of ritualized end. Many were simply disappeared from the records. They weren't mentioned again. Their villas were cleared out, their names were chipped off the walls of the weaving rooms, and they became ghosts in their own home. It was a social execution. One day, you're the favored secondary wife of the king, and the next, the palace bureaucracy has literally erased the fact that you were ever born. This leads us to a broader question. Why was the harem so prone to this? It comes down to the ritual of the presentation of the heir. In the Egyptian court, nothing was guaranteed. The pharaoh could choose his successor. This meant that every mother in the harem was in a perpetual, decades-long state of harem trials. Every meal, every gift, every word spoken to the pharaoh was part of a ritualized competition. Think of the atmosphere of a room where 30 women are all watching a toddler play, knowing that if that toddler grows up to be king, they'll be the most powerful woman in the world, and if he doesn't, they'll probably spend their old age in a dusty weaving shop in the Fayou. It wasn't just a house, it was a tournament of patience. And the pharaohs didn't exactly help matters. They often played the wives against each other. It was a form of control. If the harem was busy fighting itself, it wasn't fighting him. Except, of course, when it did. Ramesses III learned the hard way that when you balance a dozen competing ambitions on the head of a pin, eventually someone is going to get poked. But the rituals didn't stop with the new kingdom. If we look further down the line into the later periods of Egyptian history, the harem rituals became even more isolated and strange. By the time of the Ptolemies, the Greek-Egyptian rulers like Cleopatra, the harem had merged with the Greek idea of the court, creating a hybrid of Mediterranean drama and ancient Nile traditions. In those days, the trials were less about wax dolls and more about literal, cold-blooded poison. The rituals involved the tasting. Every single thing the royals touched, ate, or wore had to be ritually purified by a servant who was essentially a human canary in a coal mine. It created a world where you couldn't even have a snack without it being a formal, high-stakes ceremony of survival. But before we get to the poison-happy Ptolemies, we should probably float over to a different kind of royal dysfunction. Because while the Egyptians were obsessed with magic and names, the kings of the ancient Near East were busy creating rituals of their own, rituals that involved massive gold-plated ego trips and family trees that make the Habsburgs look like amateurs. Part 3. The Golden Cages and the Silent Walkers. So, we've left the humid, incense-filled weaving rooms of Egypt, where wax dolls and name erasing were the preferred methods of career advancement. But if you think the Egyptians were the only ones turning domestic life into a high-stakes psychological thriller, we really need to float across the desert to the ancient Near East, to the Persians and the Assyrians. If Egypt was a drama about magic, Persia was a drama about distance. In the Persian Empire, the King of Kings didn't just have a harem, he had a city within a city. And the rituals here weren't about wax, they were about the absolute crushing power of etiquette. Imagine living in a place where the way you walked, the way you breathed, and especially the way you approached the king could literally be a capital offense. Let's talk about the ritual of the curtain. In the Persian court, the king was often kept behind a veil of thin, expensive fabric. You could see his silhouette, you could hear his voice, but you couldn't look at his face directly unless he specifically granted you the grace of visibility. For the women of the harem, this meant that their entire lives were spent in a perpetual waiting behind various types of curtains, both literal and metaphorical. The historian Herodotus, who, to be fair, loved a bit of gossip and probably exaggerated everything, tells us that the Persian harem was a place of monumental boredom punctuated by terror. The women were guarded by a massive bureaucracy of eunuchs, who were the only men allowed to cross the thresholds. These eunuchs weren't just guards, they were the information brokers of the ancient world. They were the ones who knew who was in favor, who was sick, and who was secretly sending letters to their relatives in the provinces. There's a story about a Persian queen named Amestris, the wife of Xerxes. Now, Amestris was a woman who took the ritual of revenge to a whole new level. When she discovered that her husband was interested in another woman who happened to be her own daughter-in-law, she didn't just have a conversation about it. She waited until the king's birthday, a day when the king was ritually obligated to grant any request made by the queen. She didn't ask for jewels, she didn't ask for land, she asked for the girl's mother, her own sister-in-law, to be handed over to her. And then, in a display of harem justice that still makes historians wince, she had the woman mutilated in a way that was designed to destroy her beauty forever. It was a ritualized public statement: do not touch what belongs to the queen. It's that same snarky royal energy we saw in Egypt, but with a much sharper, more metallic edge. But let's glide over to the Assyrians for a moment, because they had a very specific, very weird ritual regarding royal children. In the Assyrian court, the House of the Succession was a place of extreme isolation. The princes were raised away from the general court, surrounded by tutors and priests who monitored their every move for omens. If a prince had a nosebleed, it wasn't just a nosebleed, it was a message from the gods that required a 3-day ritual of purification. If he tripped in the courtyard, the entire wing of the palace might be shut down while they searched for hidden demons. Imagine being a 6-year-old kid and realizing that your physical clumsiness could literally halt the gears of an empire. And then there was the ritual of the substitute king. This is one of the weirdest bits of ancient history, and it fits our dysfunctional elite vibe perfectly. When the royal astrologers predicted a great calamity for the king, usually during an eclipse, the Assyrians didn't just pray. They played a game of musical chairs with the throne. They would take a commoner, or sometimes a prisoner, dress him in the royal robes, give him the crown, and treat him like the king for a few weeks. The real king would go into hiding, pretending to be a regular guy named the farmer. The idea was that the calamity would hit the guy wearing the crown, while the real king stayed safe. But what happened to the substitute king once the eclipse passed? Well, the ritual usually ended with him being returned to his ancestors, which is a polite way of saying they killed him so the real king could come back and say, "Whew, glad that's over." There's one famous case where the substitute king, a gardener named Imiti, actually died of natural causes while he was reigning, and the real king was so shocked he just let the gardener's successor keep the job for a while. It's the ultimate failing upward story of the ancient world. The harem trials in these empires weren't always legal trials, they were trials of endurance. In the Persian court, there was a rule that if the king was traveling, his entire harem had to travel with him. Imagine a caravan of thousands of people, hundreds of wagons, and endless silk tents moving through the dusts of the Iranian plateau just because the king didn't want to leave his household behind. It was a ritual of mobile domesticity. Every night, the tents had to be set up in the exact same configuration as the palace. The same social hierarchies had to be maintained in the middle of a desert. You could be 300 miles from the nearest city, but you still couldn't speak to the person in the next tent if they were of a lower rank than you. It was a gold-plated, exhausting exercise in maintaining appearances while everything around you was dirt and wind. As we look at these ancient courts, we see a pattern emerging. The more power these people had, the more they trapped themselves in rituals designed to protect that power. They were so afraid of being human that they turned their homes into museums of behavior. But while the Persians were hiding behind curtains and the Assyrians were murdering gardeners, the Greeks were starting to look at the Eastern harem with a mixture of horror and fascination. And when Alexander the Great finally swept through these lands, he didn't just conquer the territory, he walked right into the middle of these rituals and decided to try them on for size. Let's float toward the end of the ancient world, where a young man from Macedonia is about to realize that wearing a Persian crown is a lot heavier than it looks in the brochures. So we've watched the Persians hide behind their curtains, and the Assyrians sacrifice their porridge-choking gardeners. But now we have to talk about the ultimate tourist who tried to turn the harem ritual into a lifestyle brand: Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander was a man who lived his life at a volume of 11. He didn't just want to conquer the Persians, he wanted to be the Persians, which was a huge problem for his Macedonian bros who just wanted to drink wine and hit things with spears. When Alexander finally walked into the royal palaces of Susa and Persepolis, he didn't just find gold. he found the entire infrastructure of the Persian harem, and instead of clearing it out, he decided to move in. Imagine the scene. You have these rugged, bearded Macedonian generals who have been sleeping in the mud for 10 years, and suddenly their king is wearing eyeliner, a purple tunic, and insisting that everyone perform proskynesis, the ritual of bowing down and kissing the ground in his presence. To Alexander, this was incorporating local tradition. To his friends, it was Alexander has finally lost his mind. This led to the most awkward dinner parties in the history of the world. Alexander tried to blend his two lives, which resulted in the Susa weddings. This was a massive, ritualized mass marriage where Alexander forced 80 of his top officers to marry Persian noblewomen. He wanted to literally breed a new empire into existence. It was the ultimate corporate merger, disguised as a romantic gesture. But the rituals of the Persian harem didn't quite mesh with the Greek temperament. The Greek soldiers viewed the secluded life as something suspicious, while the Persian noblewomen viewed the Greeks as unwashed barbarians who didn't know how to properly scent a room. After Alexander died, conveniently and mysteriously at age 32, most of those marriages ended in the 4th century equivalent of a ghosting. The officers just left their wives and went back to fighting over the pieces of the empire. But Alexander's death triggered a whole new era of harem trials under his successors, the Diadochi. Specifically, let's look at the Ptolemies in Egypt. This is where the story of the harem comes full circle and gets truly, deeply weird. The Ptolemies decided that if they were going to rule Egypt, they had to act like the old pharaohs. And what did the old pharaohs do? They married their sisters. Now, for the Greeks, this was a massive no-no, but for the Ptolemies, it became a ritual of power. They started calling themselves Philadelphus, sister lover, and Philomator, because when you have a whole empire to yourself, you apparently decide that the only person good enough for a Ptolemy is another Ptolemy. This led to a family tree that looked like a tangled ball of yarn. You had queens like Cleopatra II and Cleopatra III who were simultaneously aunts, mothers, and stepmothers to the same people. The harem in Ptolemaic Egypt wasn't a place of many wives. It was a fortress where family members spent their days trying to poison each other over breakfast. The rituals here were less about wax dolls and more about the banquet of death. It became a running theme in the Ptolemaic dynasty. You'd invite your brother to a nice dinner to settle your differences, and by the time the dessert tray came out, one of you was clutching your throat while the other was declaring themselves the sole ruler of Egypt. Take Cleopatra VII, the famous one. She wasn't just a seductress in a golden boat. She was a survivor of a harem culture that had been eating itself for 300 years. She saw her father flee the country, her sister get executed, and her brother try to have her killed in the desert. Her rituals were ones of pure survival. When she met Mark Antony, she didn't just show up. She staged a ritualized performance of wealth and divinity because she knew that in the ancient world, if you didn't overwhelm people with your vibes, you were just another casualty of the palace. But as the Roman Empire began to knock on the door, these ancient harem rituals finally met a force they couldn't enchant or poison away. The Romans viewed the Eastern harem with a mixture of puritanical disgust and secret envy. They called it Oriental decadence, while their own emperors were secretly building pleasure palaces on Capri that would have made Ramesses III blush.